All right, thank you very much. It's great to talk to you. Again, if you saw my presentation earlier today, then some of the approaches that you'll see here might seem familiar to you, but on a very different topic. As the title says, we're interested in the conversation and how people engage with the conversation, particularly online and especially on Facebook. Let me get started. I think the conversation itself probably doesn't need much of an introduction to this audience, but obviously it is now a site that's been going for 10 years. It launched in Australia, in Melbourne in 2011. It's since expanded very significantly and runs a number of country or regional editions, as well as TC Global. And one of the most recent new additions to the Conversation stable is the Conversation Canada, which we'll also focus on to some extent in this presentation. However, I should say I'll probably not say all that much about Conversation Canada, in part because this is obviously an Australian conference, and in part also because, frankly, the results for Conversation Canada, because it's so much newer, are not as interesting as the results for the Conversation Australia, I think. What we're interested in here is to see where the conversation is now positioned with its audience, in this case, particularly with its Facebook audience, more broadly with social media audiences, to really understand, well, does it meet its goals, I guess, of communicating scholarly and scientific work to the general public, or does it only reach particular audiences within the general public? In order to do this, what we've done here is to work with Facebook data from CrowdTangle. We have captured for 2020, for the entirety of 2020, all posts from public Australian or Canadian pages, respectively, that linked to any one of either 41 Australian or 71 Canadian news domains. These really cover the majority of the Australian or Canadian media landscape. The Australian numbers are quite a bit smaller, which is really an indication of the high level of media ownership concentration and just the lack of diversity in Australian media outlets, even compared to Canada. I should say too, when we say public Australian or Canadian pages, what we mean really is the definition by CrowdTangle, which uses the location of the page admins as an indication of what country the page focuses on. That's obviously not a perfect fit. The Conversation Africa page, for instance, is administered by Australian admins, so it shows up as an Australian page, although it obviously focuses on Africa. But that's really the best filter we have for Facebook pages and their country of origin. The other thing to say, just in terms of limitations, is obviously, well, we're focusing on public pages because that's the only opportunity for us to actually filter in CrowdTangle. There's no such information for public groups or public profiles. We're also not looking at any private profiles, of course. And CrowdTangle coverage is somewhat inconsistent and incomplete for pages with very small numbers of followers. But for our purposes, I think that's okay, because we're obviously interested in audience engagement, particularly in spaces on Facebook where there are large audiences gathered. So with those limitations in mind, what I'll present here is two forms of network analysis. Particularly, we're interested in the network between pages and the domains that they share. So it's a bipartite network, and we expect from that to see what domains are commonly shared by the same pages. We'll project this down also to a network between domains only, to basically look at the frequent co-occurrence of different domains on the same page. And obviously, we're particularly interested in the positioning of the conversation in that network. And secondly, we'll also look at the on-sharing network. So within our data set of shares, how content on Facebook is shared on from one page to another. And that really is a network between pages in the first place, although there might also be some group posts that are shared on by pages, of course. That really gives us an idea of common interests and beliefs and politics between these pages, because that's really largely why pages would share on another page's posts. And here again, we're interested in the positioning of the conversation in that network. So let me jump right in. For Australia, what this looks like. We captured about 1.4 million posts in 2020 that linked to Australian news domains, that shared about 410,000 distinct Australian news links. Of this data set, 271,000 posts were sharing on other pages or groups' Facebook posts. So looking in the first place just briefly at the dynamics of this, this is the overall kind of distribution of volume over time per week. You see there that a number of outlets are clearly in the lead. So 7 News is very actively shared, the ABC, SBS, the Guardian News, and so on. And the conversation sits somewhere in kind of a middling position, really, which is quite strong actually, I think, for an outlet that shares scientific content particularly. The link sharing network then looks something like this, I've marked where the conversation sits in all of this here. Essentially, the broad structure of this network is that there is a cluster here made up of centrist or center-left outlets, including the ABC, SBS, The Guardian, Crikey, Sydney Morning Herald, New Daily, The Age, and that's really the center of the network. So many pages share content from these domains. And there's a separate cluster really that contains many of the News Corp outlets, the Australian Sky News, news.com.au, Herald Sun, Daily Telegraph, Courier Mail, and a few other unrelated outlets as well. Those are probably also drawn together because quite frequently they're shared by pages that are actually operated by News Corp outlets as well. And beyond that, we've got some fairly heavy activity around 7 News and 9 News, but they're really not sitting in any of these clusters. Now, if we're looking at, for each of these pages at the top domain being shared, we see that that's split broadly between the ABC and 7 News. So for most of the pages in the network, their top domain, their top shared domain is either the ABC or 7 News, with others at some considerable distance. And within this network, links to the conversation are predominantly shared in that kind of centrist center-left cluster, as you can see there. So we've marked out specifically the pages that actually share conversation content. There is very little conversation content being shared by pages that predominantly share News Corp or even 7 News and 9 News links. So that is an indication really that the conversation sits in terms of interest just much closer to pages that actually share centrist and center-left media content. So if we project this down, this really demonstrates this even further. So taking out all the pages and showing here for each domain the 5 other domains that it's most frequently shared alongside with, we see the conversation sitting very close again to the ABC, Guardian, SBS, and other outlets, and quite far away from that News Corp cluster that exists there on the right of the network. Now, moving on from there to the on-sharing network in Australia, we see quite a different story. And that's because on-sharing, again, is an indication really of shared interests and shared topics. So we see some obvious clusters that emerge here. These clusters are partly political. We see a progressive and a conservative cluster in the network, and partly geographical. We see prominent clusters for Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, WA, and others, as well as one central cluster that is an overlapping cluster between national news and New South Wales news particularly. And then there are a bunch of interests that are less related to region or politics overall, but more to specific themes, everything from the NRL to Indigenous matters to the Me Too movement as well. So that's quite a different structure of the network. Within that, again, we also see some more diversity in what the top domains are that these pages are sharing. In the progressive cluster, The Guardian performs quite strongly. In the conservative cluster, we see Sky News performing quite strongly. Beyond that, the ABC and 7 News are particularly well represented again. And with 7 News, I should also say that some of these large pink nodes are actually simply the pages run by 7 News itself. They're prominent because they often share each other's content as well. So there are essentially 7 News clusters here as well. The conversation, again, is more shared in progressive network, although there are also notably here some shares in the conservative network, but often more critically. So, for instance, Craig Kelly's Facebook page has shared conversation links a few times, but largely to criticize or to pull out particular tidbits out of the coverage, for instance, of COVID mitigation strategies, and spin some new medical advice around that as well. I think I'll jump very quickly through the Canada results because, again, they're less interesting, I think, for our purposes. The overall structure looks like this, and the conversation really is hardly established yet as a major news source in Canada. In terms of the link sharing network, we see a central cluster that's really around the major outlets, CBC, Global News, CTV News, and a cluster down the side there on the left that's really around regional outlets, all owned by the same news outlet, news company. And the conversation sits somewhere in no man's land, really, at this point, and not very closely related to either of these clusters. Many of these pages ultimately share CBC News more than anything. And the conversation itself is shared in this network somewhere in the center, and it has some of its own pages attached to it, but really not very widely at all, basically. And that's really then also demonstrated by the domain-to-domain network, where the conversation really sits quite a way away from these major clusters in the network. And in terms of the on-sharing network, here we see more thematic networks, although there are also some topical ones, some regional ones. So there's a Saskatoon one, there's a Halifax one, there's a Quebec one particularly, of course. The Taiwan-Hong Kong one is Friends of Taiwan and Hong Kong, not so much Canadians located there. And in that network, well, CBC and CTV are really the major sources of news. And the conversation really doesn't appear particularly much, I'm sorry to say. And that's really because it's obviously such a new news outlet still in Canada that it simply hasn't established itself in that market particularly well yet. So to summarize very quickly, in Australia, I think we're seeing some tendencies here that may point towards a polarization between the center-left group of outlets and News Corp. The TV news outlets, 7 News and 9 News, are kind of middle of the road and maybe act as intermediaries in those networks. 7 News is linked to most often, but really mainly also simply by 7 News own Facebook pages. The ABC is actually the most shared domain for most pages, ultimately, when we look at the page level itself. The conversation is fairly well established, but not equally across that network, and it has some visibility in conservative on-sharing networks, but really mainly for criticism and in response to what it publishes. In Canada, again, the conversation doesn't really have a very strong market positioning at all yet, and beyond that, the Canadian networks are largely centered around the major players and less divided, perhaps, by any polarization or political stance. The conversation itself is, if anywhere, strong in the Indigenous activism clusters and some of the more left-wing clusters in the network as well. And that's a very quick run through. Obviously, again, the limitations I've talked about to some extent. We will want to also extend this further to look at conversation content that's being republished in other outlets, of course. So conversation content may well be visible well across this network, just not directly from the conversation, but as republished in the ABC or elsewhere. And of course, beyond this very basic page and domain network, we're also now interested in looking further at the actual themes and topics of the content that is being shared and how that aligns with what we're seeing. And beyond this also, of course, this is data for 2020, which is a fairly unique year, of course, in the COVID context. So we're also interested in how these patterns evolve over time, or did evolve over time before 2020 as well. So more to be done. And finally, then we'll also look at other platforms, of course, beyond Facebook to see how patterns are similar or different. And with that, I think I'll leave it here and pass on to the next person. Thank you.